Is there perhaps an announcement from the president of the Yale Political Union?
An announcement.
Announcement.
Hello and welcome, dear members and friends, to this evening's wonderful debate. Last week, the Yale Political Union held our annual Gardner-White Prize debate. I would like to urge everyone to take a look at our Instagram or Facebook page to learn about the history of this wonderful event, courtesy of Gardner-White winner and my historian, Rishi Guruswamy, from the Progressive Party. He's a great historian. I would also like to highlight some of the other winners of last week's debate. Congratulations to Mr. William Berry from the Federalist Party and Mr. Owen Robertson from the Party of the Left for placing second. And congratulations to Ms. Grace O'Grady from the Progressive Party for placing third. Also, our brand new Best Question Award was awarded to the sometime chairman of the Party of the Right, Ms. Eleanor Elizabeth Lubell, and also to Gino Salza from the Libertarian Party. Last but not least, I would like to thank everyone who spoke last week. It can be quite daunting to compete, especially as one's maiden speech as it was for some of the people present. But they all did a stellar job, and they should all feel really proud about what they accomplished. Everyone should have also received some feedback from me. If they didn't, let me know, please. In terms of programming, I do have an exciting non-debate related announcement to make, which is that next month, 10 YPU leaders will be having a lunch with the president of Yale University, Ms. Maureen McInnes, for an off-the-record conversation on our organization's objectives and history and so on and so forth. We will keep you all updated on that. Also, our executive board this weekend will be traveling to Mystic, Connecticut for a well-deserved executive board retreat. Now it is my privilege to introduce our two guests for this evening's debate. Gerard Baker is the editor-at-large and former editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal. Educated at Oxford University, Mr. Baker began his career at the Bank of England before moving into journalism. Over several decades, he worked for organizations including the BBC, the Financial Times, and the Times of London, building a reputation as an economic and political commentator with a generally conservative viewpoint. His writing often focuses on US politics, global economics, and transatlantic relations. And he remains a visible figure in policy discussions and media commentary today. Similarly, Ms. Molly Jong-Fast is an accomplished and acclaimed American writer and journalist. She is known for her sharp cultural observations and outspoken liberal political analysis, mostly as a political analyst at MSNBC, as the host of the podcast entitled Fast Politics, and as an opinion writer for the New York Times. I would like to remind everyone that Yale is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent. Interfering with a speaker's ability to hear and speak, and the audience's ability to do so as well, is not consistent with the university's free expression policies. Please note that both of our guests will be delivering opening remarks, but stay until the very end, as after just 4 brief student speeches, they will also be delivering some closing remarks. If audience members must leave before then, please do so quietly and respectfully. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I move that the Yale Political Union debate resolve. Journalists are to blame for the loss of public trust.
Second. Hearing seconds and no objections, it is so moved. Is there perhaps a first docketed speech in the affirmative?
For the speech.
Speech.
Thank you very much indeed. I was warned about the hisses. I didn't expect the first hiss of the evening to be for my alma mater, the University of Oxford. But I suppose, you know, when you're 4 or 5 years, 100 years older than this university, I suppose you get used to it. So thank you for that. Mr. Speaker, trust is the essential foundation of a functioning society. It's the lubricant of social interaction. It facilitates the exchanges necessary for economic efficiency. It undergirds the relationship between citizens and their cultural, corporate, and political leaders. Low trust societies have been proven to be less stable, less dynamic, less prosperous, and less happy than their high trust counterparts. But trust isn't something that's simply conferred by people on each other or by citizens on their leaders. Trust has to be earned and repeatedly re-earned day after day by those who want to be trusted. And when it comes to public trust, the faith that people place in those with power over them, journalism plays a critical role. Good journalism tests trust. By holding the powerful to account and exposing their actions to public scrutiny, it tells us whether or not they deserve our trust. But to play that vital role in society, journalists themselves must be trusted. Citizens must believe that news organisations are committed to telling them the truth. Now, for a long time in this country, that was roughly, broadly how it worked. Newspapers, news organisations were believed. People thought they told the truth. But sadly, Mr. Speaker, today it's no longer the case. Americans have essentially stopped trusting the news media. Every year the Gallup organisation asks Americans whether they have a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in a whole range of institutions, particularly in the way the news is reported accurately or fairly. Now, in 1976, 50 years ago, 72% of Americans said they had a great deal or fair amount of confidence. That number steadily declined over the last half century, and last year, Gallup recorded it at its lowest level ever. Just 28% of Americans say they have a lot of or a fair amount of trust and confidence in the news. So for comparison, that means news organisations enjoy about as much trust today as used car dealers or tarot card readers. Now, we can laugh or stamp or hiss or whatever it is we do here, but it's a calamitous state of affairs for democracy that news is so little trusted. Now, you will hear media people themselves, you may well hear it tonight from my opponent and from other speakers, that there are various people to blame for this state of affairs, for this loss of trust in news. They blame malevolent forces out there, social media, disinformation, right-wing tech bros, media moguls, Russia, and of course, the number one villain for everything, Donald Trump. Now, it's true that many of these institutions and people have indeed contributed to declining faith in the old media. And I'm going to state unreservedly here, so there's no misunderstanding, President Trump's attacks on the media are disgraceful and indefensible. That kind of bullying is indeed a threat to our freedoms, and I thoroughly oppose it. But it doesn't ever seem to occur to the president's opponents, to his targets, why it is that he's able to get away with these attacks, why he's able to make them, and so many people seem to agree to them. The reason is that the trust in these institutions has already been devastated, not by some outsider, not by the president himself, but by their own tendentious work and activity over years and years and years. The blame lies principally not with these outsiders, but with journalists themselves. Long ago, too many reporters and editors stopped seeking out and telling people the truth, wherever it led them, but instead chose to propagate a particular ideological line, to use their position to promote a political and cultural worldview. Here I am supporting this resolution tonight, and I'm going to lay out why I think that's happened and how it's happened, how journalists forfeited the precious trust they once did hold by abusing their positions as the supposed custodians of truth, and instead asserting opinion, conjecture, and ideology in its place. Most of it a very, very familiar progressive left ideology that has for too long infected too much of the media in this country. It's that betrayal of the ideas of truth and objectivity that's fatally undermined Americans' confidence in the news. Now, I should stay at the start, I should place put my own cards on the table, explain a little bit about who I am. Thank you very much indeed for the introduction, Mr. President. I was indeed editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal. Now I was running the news side of the Wall Street Journal, where I dealt with a lot of these issues of trust and of objectivity and truthfulness on a daily basis. Now I'm on the opinion side of the Wall Street Journal, where those things don't matter so much. No, I'm kidding. That was not true. But you might also notice from my accent that, and as I said, from where I was brought up, I am an American citizen now. I'm a very proud American citizen. But I started out on the other side of the Atlantic, where it is fair to say journalists have long had a reputation, to be honest with you, that lacks quite a lot in credibility and quality. And that's been the case for a very long time. British journalism has been held in very low esteem by the British people for a long time. In fact, there was a piece of verse written as long ago as the middle of the 19th century, which captures very well the way the public viewed British journalists. It said, "You cannot hope to bribe or twist, thank God, the British journalist. But seeing what the man will do unbribed, there's no occasion to." So I know whereof I speak when I talk about the loss of truth and objectivity in American journalism. In the 30 years that I've been in American journalism, I've witnessed, sadly, this decline of trust. Now, I should say the Wall Street Journal, which I was proud to edit and which my successors continue to do a great job, is a glaring exception to this phenomenon. The Wall Street Journal is, in fact, according to all surveys, the most trusted news organisation in America. And it continues to be, and it shows that actually good quality journalism delivered in an objective and fair way can actually not only survive but thrive, as the journal is doing. But we are close to being unique. Most people say news organisations, yes, even those run by Americans, can't be trusted. So what happened? How do we go from this trust to distrust in such a short time? Well, it's true that the media most of the traditional media did always trend left back in the 1960s. You can go back and read those great accounts of cosy dinners between Bill Bradley of the Washington Post and John F. Kennedy, his best friend. But the change really began to deteriorate dramatically in the 1980s, when news became increasingly partisan and ideological, again, from a principally left-wing perspective, and this intensified through the 1990s and 2000s. The main vehicles, newspapers, TV news, news networks, promoted a one-sided view of the world on everything from tax and spending to foreign policy to social questions like gun control, abortion, gender and sexual identity. It was a monolithically one-sided view that you would see in the major news organisations day after day and night after night. Now, I think part of what went on was that you had a kind of demographic change among news organisations themselves, among people who went into news. Back in the 1950s and 60s, and earlier than that, journalism wasn't seen as a profession, it was seen as more of a craft. Most journalists, many of them, did not go to expensive and distinguished universities like this one. They went off and went in straight into journalism at 16, 17, 18, straight out of high school, and were very good. And those people didn't have a particular ideological agenda. They didn't have a particular desire to change the world. They wanted to simply to report, to find out the facts and hold people accountable. But again, particularly beginning after Watergate, when journalists became heroes and prime movers and shakers in the great events that decided the country, there was a change, and more people who went to university, journalism became essentially an occupation you had to have been to university for, and in fact, especially in this country, graduate journalism schools across the country. So you had a social and cultural and demographic shift, which I think explained in part this significant movement towards a more partisan, a more ideological, a more tendentious form of journalism. What happened then, beginning in the 1980s, was the beginning of alternatives to those traditional news organizations. And it was then, I think, that Americans began to see and began to have exposed to them the biases, the skew, the tendentiousness of so much American news. Conservative talk radio, which came along in the 70s and 80s. The arrival of a right-of-centre news source in Fox News in the 1990s. And then, of course, the internet at the end of the 90s and through the 2000s, which enabled people to find sources of information that exposed the reporting that they had seen in the traditional news organisations. But again, let's be clear, these were not the causes of declining media trust, they were the response to declining media trust. People were losing trust and were seeking alternatives. Then, just to telescope this history a little bit, when Donald Trump came along, this ideological approach to the news, this partisan, politicised approach to the news intensified. And we had throughout that first Donald Trump campaign and the first Donald Trump term. Allegations, of course, that Trump was a Russian agent, the Russia collusion story. Most major news organizations spent a year and a half trying to convince people that Donald Trump had actually been recruited by the Russians and was a Russian agent. It wasn't true. We had similar kind of supposedly authoritative reporting during COVID, during Black Lives Matter, the summer of 2020, these moments when America really needed serious reporting that investigated these trends that we were actually going through, whether it was the kind of messages we were getting, the authoritative messages we were getting during the pandemic, or the mass response to the killing of George Floyd, and the way in which the public and the institutions, the media, corporations fell into this frenzy of kind of this idea that America is a white supremacist country. The news, instead of challenging any of that, most of these news organizations continued to propagate it. As any journalist will tell you, the most significant form of bias is not what editors and reporters choose to write about, it's what they choose not to write about. It is selectivity bias. That is true, that has always been true, but again, it's, you can see it on display today. As I wrote in the Wall Street Journal just last week, I have been, like all of us, I'm sure, horrified by some of the things I've seen on the streets of Minneapolis in the last month. I applaud those journalists who have gone out there and exposed what has gone on, and I'm delighted to see that it does seem to have elicited a response. I think the Trump administration's enforcement was overreach and absolutely unacceptable. But it is also worth asking, why, and I went back and looked, I checked in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN, where were reporters reporting on the impact that illegal immigration was having on the United States throughout the previous decade? Where was the impact? Where there are tens of thousands of illegal immigrants in American prisons. Where were the stories about what they had done, their crimes and their victims? Where were the stories about the way in which there was lots of stories about how illegal migrants and migrants generally were contributing enormously to the US economy. There were very few stories about the social and other dislocative effects that they were having. Now again, you can have a view on this. I'm an immigrant myself. I'm very strongly pro-immigration, but I do ask, as an American, why aren't these news organizations reporting all aspects of the story? And the answer is because they have an ideological agenda. This decline in trust has been genuinely catastrophic for American democracy. I don't celebrate it. I don't celebrate the loss of authority of news organizations because they are essential to our democracy. Achieving accountability now, whether it's political accountability, the accountability of major corporations, the accountability of unions, the accountability of anybody in power, is much, much harder. It's really impossible, almost impossible to imagine that Watergate would actually unfold today in the way that it did 50 years ago. We have, frankly, and again, I'm happy to say this, that we have levels of corruption by this administration that are beyond anything that we've ever seen before, which is reported on, but nobody seems to care. It seems to have no effect. There is no real practical accountability. Donald Trump, in a lifetime of saying many, many false things, the truest thing Donald Trump ever said was when he said, I could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and not lose any votes. And that's absolutely true. He wouldn't lose any votes because people wouldn't believe the media were reporting it, or they'd say, well, Joe Biden probably killed people anyway. We have lost the accountability, the crucial accountability that is essential for our democracy to work. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the great Democratic senator from New York in the 1960s and 70s, said, you're entitled to your own opinions, but you're not entitled to your own facts. What we have today is a bifurcated media, is a world in which people are entitled to their own facts. They choose their own facts. They choose the facts they want to believe, which accord with their own opinions. We no longer have an agreed-upon set of facts. That is a disaster for democracy. And yet much of the media continues to insist that others are to blame, to warn that democracy lies in darkness, and to talk about the ominous forces outside that are threatening liberty. Well, there's no class of people in America with a more keenly developed sense of their own importance or a less well-developed sense of their own self-awareness than American journalists. At precisely the moment At precisely the moment that America needs a trusted press to save it from the excesses of a rampant executive, the damage that journalists have done to public faith is matched only by their refusal to acknowledge or even understand how far they have fallen in public esteem. It wasn't greedy tech titans or rapacious proprietors that caused so much damage to journalism and the news, but the vanities, prejudices, and dishonesty of so many of its own practitioners. Thank you very much.
Questions?
Oh, questions.
Questions for Mr. Baker? Perhaps a question, the chair.
I think that's for comment. The guest's central argument is that at some point, the news used to be objectively true, and then one day the left came on the scene and disturbed everything and made the news entirely subjective and completely untrustworthy. And I disagree with the argument that the guest presents in that form. Isn't it in fact the case that that argument requires a presupposition that the left is ideological and the right is not? The right is completely right? So I'm just confused by the guest here. Isn't it in fact the case that everyone comes with an ideology, and in certain conditions that ideology is expressed, in other conditions it's not?
Yeah, I answer now. Yes, of course it's true that everybody comes with an ideology. The problem for the last 50 years has been that most of the media come from one particular ideology. It's not the problem that only the left is ideological and the right isn't ideological. If he'd listened to my remarks when I said what we have today is a bifurcated press, so we have Fox News, and we have Breitbart, and we have other news organizations that cater to people who want a particular right-wing ideological viewpoint, and we have everybody else that caters to the left. That is the problem. The reason we have that, the reason that these, as I said, that these media platforms grew up, beginning with talk radio, going through Fox News, and the flowering that we got with the birth of the internet, was because people realised that half the country, at least, wasn't being catered for by the media. There's an old joke that Rupert Murdoch founded Fox News in 1996 because he thought there was a niche in the market. And then he liked to say afterwards it turned out the niche was more than 50%. That was the problem. Yes, I am saying that the media was controlled by people of a particular ideological perspective, which is reflected, by the way, in all kinds of surveys of journalist views, surveys of journalist voting behaviour, surveys of every stories all the stories that these news organisations did. So yes, it was dominated, still is, most of the media still is dominated by a left-wing perspective. There has, in response and in opposition, been the rise of right-wing media. I don't think that condition is a healthy condition for democracy, to have people choosing to believe only what fits with their own views. If you are not exposed to alternative information and to alternative views, you are not going to learn anything.
Further questions for the guest? Perhaps a question, photographer.
One being selective coverage, another being more argumentative coverage, and the last being outright false coverage. It seems that we have a lot of examples of selective coverage, some good examples of argumentative coverage, and yet most of the criticisms from people who do not trust the media would argue that the media is outright lying and is following false coverage. How do we come to this?
Well, so, obviously, falsity can take many forms. It can be a form of commission or a form of omission. I would argue that large parts of the reporting on Donald Trump's connections with Russia in 2016 and 2017 was an act of commission, which was false. By the way, some of those reports won the Pulitzer Prize for that reporting. Large parts of it, especially stuff that appeared in the Washington Post, but also in the New York Times, was wrong, was just wrong. They reported stories, they reported facts, supposed facts, as facts that were turned out not to be facts. So we did see that. There's the falsity of omission, which is the kind of reporting that we got for most of Joe Biden's presidency. When we are now learning, that so many journalists knew that Joe Biden was suffering from advanced dementia and incapable of doing the job of president. Yet until the Wall Street Journal wrote a story in the middle of June 2024, just a couple of weeks before that infamous presidential debate, none of those media organisations reported on it. Why did they not report on Biden's debilities and incapacity? So, yeah, there are plenty of examples of falsity by commission, falsity by omission, by choice, by selectivity, and I'm afraid the media has been rife with it.
For perhaps a penultimate question, Ms. Cowan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the gentleman for his speech, he says that journalism has largely fallen away from the sense of objective truth, yet he also values public trust and social order in American democracy. My question is, to what extent is the public owed the truth, or the whole truth and nothing but the truth, even when that truth may erode public trust in institutions?
I mean, I believe, both as a journalist, but more importantly as a citizen, that in the maximum transparency. Now, I think there always have to be exceptions. I think national security is an obvious exception. There are certain circumstances where revealing things that individuals have done, or the allegations against individuals that maybe haven't been founded very well, that aren't founded in law or aren't founded in evidence, but are there in information. One thinks about, for example, what's going on with the Epstein files. While I'm all in favour of publishing all that information, I think we do need to be, there are areas where we do need to be careful, but broadly speaking, I would favour the publication, publish and be damned. As someone famously said, I think we are better off having information, having all the information that's out there for us to consider, again, with very, very few exceptions. So I'm all in favour of transparency, much more than we have.
And for perhaps a final question, Mr. Chung.
Thank you. So the guest seems to pinpoint the downfall and politicization of American journalism to the professionalization of journalism through grad school and through undergrad training. And yet, people are political before and after grad school, right? So what is it specifically about grad school that caused people to be biased, or journalists to be biased in their reporting? And what has the Wall Street Journal done differently to prevent that?
So, I mean, obviously he's misunderstood my point. My point isn't that people arrive at university with a completely open mind, and are then that mind into which things are poured. There may be some people like that, possibly at Yale, but it certainly wasn't true at Oxford. People, generally speaking, of course they have their views, but the point I was making is that it's the kind of people who want to go to distinguished universities, to expensive universities, to go and do all the kind of things that life is opened up for them by doing that. It's that motivation who then go into journalism, that makes them more likely to have a left-of-centre perspective than to have a right-of-centre perspective or an independent perspective. It's not that they are, although I think they almost certainly are, but it's not that they are necessarily taught things at university or graduate school that turn these pure objective individuals into left-wing ranters. It is the fact that the journalism profession, as it is called, is now full of people who wanted to do that in the first place. That is the problem.
And with that, Mr. Baker is thanked. Is there perhaps a first docketed speech in the negative for the speech?
For the speech.
The speech.
All right, so you're going to have to bear with me because I did not go to college and I have never debated. So I am just totally new at this. But I want to talk to Mr. Baker about the column he wrote last week, which laid out this argument. And in it, he starts, so I'm going to talk a little bit about his argument and why I think it's wrong. First is, he says, and I'm going to read a little bit of the column, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think it's wrong. So the biggest threat to journalism, journalists. Don't blame rapacious editors for loss of public trust. Blame bias, incompetent reporting. Is there a class of people with more vaunted self-belief or more stunted self-awareness than America's journalists? Democracy dies in darkness, they tell us, The implication being that it is only the torch held aloft by the nation's brave media folk that keep the light of freedom glowing in the gathering dusk of an authoritarian age. It's true, and so we're gonna talk about, I'm gonna stop there, and I'm gonna talk about this phrase, democracy dies in darkness, because I think it's an important phrase, and you use it to make a point. So the thinking is the phrase that is the catchphrase for the Washington Post. But I'm sure you guys wonder where it comes from, right? Does it come from journalists? Well, you'll be interested to know that, and this is, I think, pretty interesting. It's from an editorial from the Washington Post. The paper's owner, Amazon.com founder, Jeff Bezos, used the phrase, hero to journalism. He fired half of his staff last week. So the paper's owner, Jeff Bezos, used the phrase in an interview with the Post executive editor, Marty Barron, who was a really wonderful editor, at a tech forum at the Post in May 2017. I think a lot of us believe that democracy dies in darkness, that certain institutions have a very important role in making sure that there is light, he said. That was 2017 when Jeff Bezos still believed in democracy. A lot has changed since then. But where did this phrase come from? Did Jeff Bezos come up with this phrase? What do you guys think? No. So Jeff Bezos got this phrase from Bob Woodward. Bob Woodward, one of the legendary Woodward and Bernstein journalists, right? Bob Woodward has written many books about his work during Watergate, many, many books, and one of those books was The Last of the President's Men. But did Bob Woodward cook this phrase up? No. This phrase comes from, Bob Woodward, when asked if he cooked this phrase up, he said, sort of. But the phrase is actually, democracy dies behind closed doors. And you want to know where this comes from? It comes from a judge called Damon J. Keith, who was a US federal judge, and he ruled in 2002 against secret post-9/11 deportation hearings. And he coined that phrase. So I'm gonna read a little bit from that decision, but first I want to talk about Justice Keith, because I think that he is a pretty important figure. When we look back at the post-9/11, the things that happened that took away civil liberties after 9/11. And I say this as someone who lived in New York during 9/11, who was very affected by it, and who lived through that period. Keith studied under Thurgood Marshall in law school. He was born in 1922 in Detroit. He graduated from Northwestern High School. He went to West Virginia State College. He earned a law degree from Howard University. He was the grandson of enslaved people. All right, so I'm going to read a little bit from this decision, Detroit Free Press versus Ashcroft, from the Sixth Circuit, United States Court of Appeal. Because the whole point of this argument is, what does journalism do, right? What is the job of a journalist? What is the job of bringing sunlight into stories like this? And if you think about it, there is no greater expression of successful journalism than changing the law. Than changing the world, right? That's what ultimately the goal is, though it's not very much the goal of opinion journalists. Anyway, of which I am, so. Lastly, the public's interests are best served by open proceedings. And these are immigration proceedings, and this is about letting the Detroit Free Press into these immigration proceedings. A true democracy is one that operates on faith. Faith that government officials are forthcoming and honest, and faith that informed citizens will arrive at logical conclusions. This is a vital reciprocity that Americans should not discard in troubling times. Without question, the events of September 11, 2000 left an indelible mark on our nation, But we as a people are united in the wake of the destruction to demonstrate to the world that we are a country deeply committed to preserving the rights and freedoms guaranteed by our democracy. Today, we reflect our commitment to those democratic values by ensuring that our government is held accountable to the people and the First Amendment rights. And our First Amendment rights are not compromised. Open proceedings with a vigorous and scrutinizing press serve to ensure the durability of our democracy. So I think it's really important when we talk about journalism to talk about why we have it and why it's important. And again, Mr. Baker makes a lot of really good points, but he assumes that trust in journalism has just gone down, and it actually hasn't. If you look at the numbers, and again, polling it's not a science. We have a lot of problems, but it doesn't go straight down. It meanders. There are high points in the 70s. There are high points in the 80s. There are high points in the 90s. And so it's not a straight line, number one. And number two, I'm going to read something, but I want to talk before, because I'm going to read something that I wanted to read later, but I think it's really important for this moment, because the question really is, why are Americans, and again, I would argue, why do a lot of Americans have an unfavorable view about journalism, right? And I'm going to read something, but I'm just going to say, this is one other thing here. Trust peaked at 55% in 1998 and 1999. So it's not, this is not just a completely straight line. It declined to 28% in 2025. You know what started in 1997? It's Fox News. I'm just saying. Fox News, owned by Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch, who bought the Wall Street Journal in 2007, you became the editor-in-chief in 2013. The Wall Street Journal has a notoriously right-wing ed page. Now, I would say that, sorry guys, I'm just here to tell the truth. I would say that the New York Times has an ed page, which I work at, which is also maybe more ideologically liberal, but we do have conservative columnists, whereas the Wall Street Journal does not have liberal columnists. Okay, well, anyway, so I'm going to read a few paragraphs from Lydia Polgreen in the New York Times, but I will say that if you were to think about someone who has monetized news in a way that has been very involved with divisive rhetoric, you might look to Rupert Murdoch. And I'm going to add one other thing I'm actually going to add two other things here. One is this idea that news is primarily positive towards liberals and negative towards Democrats, and negative towards Republicans. And I'm going to talk about the 2016 election cycle. And I'm going to quote the Shorenstein News Center at Harvard, okay? You guys, there have to be other universities, I'm sorry. The overall scorecard, okay, from January 2015 to November 2016, when looking at the entire 18-month campaign, Hillary Clinton actually faced a higher percentage of negative coverage than Donald Trump. I'm just telling you what they found. They found that for Hillary Clinton, 62% of her coverage was negative, and 38% of her coverage was positive. And for Donald Trump, 56% of his coverage was negative, and 44% of his coverage was positive. Okay. Now, I want to talk I'm going to say one more thing about Fox News, which is one of the big money makers of Rupert Murdoch's industry. I'm going to talk about Sean Hannity, who has the highest rated show on Fox News, and one of the things that he says when he is pressed about his journalistic ethics is he says, I'm not a journalist, I'm a talk host. Mr. Hannity is unapologetic about his aim. This is from 2015 or 2016. I am not hiding the fact that I want Donald Trump to be the next president of the United States. He said, after all, I never claimed to be a journalist. All right, so now I'm just going to read one last thing for you to think about. And again, I am not saying that one person is, I'm not saying that journalists, I'm just arguing in the negative. So I'm just saying that journalists are not responsible for the loss of public trust. I'm not telling you who is, I'm just telling you it's not them. This is from Lydia Polgreen in the New York Times. At the end of the century, a journalism scholar published a fascinating comparative study of regional newspapers in the early 1960s and late 1990s. Papers of the 1960s seemed naively trusting of the government, shamelessly boosterish, unembarrassingly hokey, and obligated. Carl Sessions-Steck, the researcher, wrote, newspapers of the 90s were better written, better looking, better organized, more responsible, less sensational, less sexist and racist, and more informative and public spirited. Okay, that sounds good. This sounds, you might think, salutary for the health of democracy, but it may have been precisely this move away from deferential stenography and towards fearless investigation that led to declining trust in the news media. Aggressive, probing, and accountability-oriented journalism held up a mirror to American society, and many Americans did not like what they saw. As news grew more negative and more critical, people had more reason to find journalism distasteful. The media scholar Michael Schultzen wrote in a provocative essay on the problem of assessing trust in journalism. What people do not like about the media is its implicit or explicit criticism of their heroes or their home teams. No one famously likes the bearer of bad news.
Questions for Mr. Jong-Fast. Perhaps a question, Ms. Dunjevich. Further questions for the lady. Perhaps a question, Mr. Tsao.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the lady believe that the primary objective of journalists is to advance the public interest as he or she sees as forced to tell the truth? And what happens when those two objectives are in conflict?
That's a good question. I think that it's to tell the truth. I think when you get into trouble is when you decide that you want to put your finger on the scale. And I think that absolutely the goal should be the truth. And in fact, what you see when you see, here's a question for you. One of the things that Mr. Baker writes about in his column is this idea that journalists focus too much on accountability for the rich and powerful, for Republican politicians, so I would argue it would be for all politicians, and that they don't focus enough on academic institutions. You guys are all Ivy League students. Do you feel that the mainstream media focuses on academic institutions? So I think that but I agree. I think it should be focused on truth and not on the public good.
Further questions for the lady. Perhaps a question, the chairman of the party to the right.
The bearer of bad news. And yet when Walter Cronkite tells the American people that the president is lying to them, they listen. And now when in 2026, when the New York Times says that the president is lying to them, they think it's Tuesday. What has changed between America during Watergate and America now, such that this massive difference in reaction is happening? if it isn't the journalists?
I mean, I think it's the world has changed. I mean, you had a world where you had very limited media outlets. You had a very few newspapers. You had very few television programs. Everything was you had censors. You had a lot of regulation for television, a lot of regulation for newspapers. You had blacklists. I mean, you just had a country that was much less free in a lot of ways. And then you also had presidents who were, I think there was just a much higher level of censorship. I also think that Walter Cronkite was, I think it was a very unusual moment in American life. And I think that Richard Nixon was an enormous shift for the American people because they certainly had corrupt presidents, but he was a sort of shift in the way Americans saw the world. But they also had a relationship with Cronkite.
For perhaps a penultimate question, the chair.
One thing that I'm curious about is that truthful journalism doesn't necessarily mean for entertaining journalism. And one of the reasons we see institutions like Fox News, CNN, all of these big media companies is because people kind of reward entertaining journalism. So what are we to do about sort of the trade-off between like entertainment and truth in journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, again, that is one of the big problems with journalism, and that's one of the problems with this sort of algorithm and clickbait and, catchy titles and, I mean, the Nick Shirley reporting story is such an important story because, so Nick Shirley is this YouTuber, I think a lot of you probably know who he is, and he, yes, that's right. And he reported about fraud that had happened during COVID many years before and had actually been prosecuted by the Biden administration. There were people in jail for it. But because a lot of the people, the tech bros on X, had not heard about the story, had not read the numerous pieces in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, which has, by the way, some of the very best reporting, I think the head page is, but the reporting is amazing. And had not seen that, they thought it was all new. And they got the Trump White House all excited, and they sent ICE into Minnesota for a crime that had happened many years before. And so I do think that there is a bias. If people haven't seen reporting, they believe it doesn't exist. And that is just, I think, a lack of news literacy among the very, very wealthy tech bros, and someone who should give them a news literacy class.
And for perhaps a final question, the senior treasurer.
This is really a question for both of you, even though you can answer. But I once had like a very interesting conversation with James Bennett, who was, I'm sure you guys know the editorial of the New York Times, since he was like forced by resignation after he reported about Trump, and like he wrote like a very controversial piece and then was forced to resign. Like how much of the erosion of trust is on like the corporatization of media and like this whole like profit maximizing, like don't talk about controversial stuff because it'll like lose our fan base type of situation. Question.
So I just want to go back to James Bennett because the reason why he resigned was because Senator Tom Cotton wrote a piece. Yeah, that's good. I like it. Who wrote a piece about sending the troops into American cities, something that Donald Trump now has no problem doing. And it was at a time when that was considered to be a very, very, and I still think controversial idea. And he resigned because of a number of reasons, but some of which was maybe he didn't know that the piece was coming and had not been the stalwart he probably should have. I mean, that's just the history of that. I think that what you see is, I think that news is largely reporting, if you follow the story, and you want to get to the truth. That ultimately does, it is rewarded, but I also think that there are some times when, I don't know, I think journalism for profit has been a problem, but you do see outlets like ProPublica, and you do where it's just reporting, and there's no opinion, and it's set up in a sort of nonprofit model, which I think is a good example of a place where they break stories all the time. They hold people to account all the time, and it works really well.
And with that, Ms. Jong-Fast is thanked.
Very brief closing remarks are just from one of the speeches we've heard before about this idea of moral politicians, because it's sort of fascinating. And I would say that the media has exposed our politician, our president, Donald Trump, to not be moral, and voters still voted for him. So obviously they don't care. That's all I know.
Well, thanks. It's been an instructive evening. It's been enjoyable. I've listened to lots and lots of really good arguments and interventions and comments. I have to say I haven't really heard anybody significantly, seriously dispute the fundamental proposition, which is that journalists are no longer trusted, or the proposition, which is the subject of this resolution, that journalists are responsible for that. We can argue about the different weights that different institutions and individuals may have played in undermining trust, but no one really seriously has argued that journalists have not forfeited the trust of the American people. What I'd say in conclusion, in support of the resolution, is I think the way to think about it is like this. Journalism used to play the role in society until, 50 years ago. It used to play quite a quasi-juridical role in society. It played to the cause of public opinion. It went out to establish the facts, it found out the facts, it presented the facts, and it presented those facts to an audience to make up their minds and to come to a judgment. That's no longer the case. Journalists now play a quasi-religious role in society. They believe they have the revealed truth, like the medieval priesthood, and it's their job to go out and to preach to those people, mostly to the converted these days, whether it's the right, Fox News, or the left, everything else pretty much. But their job is to be the sort of priesthood, to actually convey the truth, to comfort people, to reassure them that their prejudices and their views and their view of the world are actually correct. That's a disastrous situation. It's not what journalism should be. Journalism is not here to offer religious comfort to people who have quasi-religious comfort to people who have views, particularly strong political views. And it's journalists, I'm afraid, as no one has really disputed tonight, who are responsible for having forfeited the trust that leaves us in the situation we're in.
Is there perhaps an appropriate motion?
The motion, Vice President. I move we can yes. So we can yes.
Is there perhaps another motion?
Motion. I move the previous question.
Seconds and no objections. It is so moved. We will now come to a vote. All those abstaining. By a vote of 16 to 23. Mayor. Mr. Baker.
I move we adjourn. Making two ideas there.